on aphorism, or we are, 26, Prelude to a Philosophy of the Future, translated by Walter Kaufmann, by Friedrich Nietzsche. Or Nietzsche. Okay, aphorism 26. This is interesting because he's talking about how better types of intellect want to get away from the crowd. They want to get away from the common man, but they're drawn back because, well, I'll just read it, shall I? Every choice human being strives instinctively for a citadel and a secrecy where he is saved from the crowd, the many, the great majority, where he may forget men who are the rule, being their exception, excepting only the one case in which he is pushed straight to such men by a still stronger instinct, as a seeker after knowledge in the great and exceptional sense. Anyone who, in intercourse with men, does not occasionally glisten in all the colors of distress, the green and gray of with disgust, satiety. I always have a problem with that. Satiety. Sympathy, gloominess, and loneliness, is certainly not a man of elevated tastes. Supposing, however, that he does not take all this burden and disgust upon himself voluntarily, that he persistently avoids it and remains, as I said, quietly and proudly hidden in his citadel, one thing is certain. He was not predestined for knowledge. Right? So, this is elitism, potentially, but it's also just honesty. So people get away from those, they don't spend their time in the mall. They get away from these things. The thing is, if they really want knowledge, they'll have to put their gaze back on such things. Popular culture, whatever. The oddities, and you can't just say, oh, well, that's just commonness, so it doesn't matter. No, the rule is interesting. Exception is also interesting. But you can't get rid of the rule being interesting, even if, like, the rule is Hollywood movies. Well, mostly they're not that interesting. But it's interesting why they are the way they are. Right? They might not be directly interesting in the way they're intended to be for their audience, but as a seeker of knowledge, you're a different part of a different kind of audience, and there is stuff to learn from patterns and such phenomena. Not predestined for knowledge. If he were, he would one day have to say to himself, the devil take my good taste. But the rule is more interesting than the exception, than myself, the exception. And he would go down, and above all, he would go inside. The long and serious study of the average man, and consequently much disguise, self-overcoming, familiarity, and bad contact, parentheses, all contact is bad contact except with one's equals. This constitutes a necessary part of the life history of every philosopher, perhaps the most disagreeable, odious, and disappointing part. I don't really like the elitist framing that he uses. All contact is bad contact except when one's equals. But what are you going to do? If he is fortunate, however, as a favorite child of knowledge should be, he will encounter suitable shortcuts and helps for his task. I mean so-called cynics. Those who simply recognize the animal, the commonplace, and the rule in themselves, and at the same time still have that degree of spirituality and that itch which makes them talk of themselves and their likes before witnesses. Sometimes they even wallow in books as on their own dung. Cynics. That's a compliment of cynics. Cynicism is the only form in which base souls approach honesty, and the higher man must listen closely to every coarse or subtle cynicism and congratulate himself when a clown without shame or a scientific satyr speaks out precisely in front of him. I've said a lot about cynics and cynicism. There are even cases where enchantment mixes with disgust, namely, whereby a freak of nature, genius is tied to some such indiscreet billy goat and ape, as in the case of Abbe Galliani, the profoundest, most clear-sighted, and perhaps also filthiest man of his century. He was far profounder than Voltaire, and consequently also a good deal more taciturn. I don't know who that is offhand. There's a note on him. A Neapolitan of diminutive size, secretary in the embassy of Paris. Lively wit. happens more frequently, has been hinted, that a scientific head is placed on an ape's body, a subtle exceptional understanding and a base soul, an occurrence by no means rare, especially among doctors and physiologists of morality. And I can imagine this. I mean, I've seen a strong intellect on theists, and it's weird that the one does not extinguish the other in either way. And whenever anyone speaks without bitterness, quite innocently, of man as a belly with two requirements, a head with one, whenever anyone sees, seeks, or wants to see only hunger, sexual lust, and vanity as the real and only motive of human actions. So, and whenever anyone speaks without bitterness, quite innocently, of man as a belly with two requirements, and a head with one, whenever anyone sees, seeks, and wants to see only hunger, sexual lust, and vanity as the real and only motives of human actions, in short, when anyone speaks badly and not even wickedly of man, the lover of knowledge should listen subtly and diligently. He should altogether have an open ear wherever people talk without indignation. So this is the kind of message people take as a mixed message. But what he's saying is that cynicism is a sort of a higher achievement of a lower time. And when people talk about humans as just bacteria with brains, you know, or apes with brains, we should listen. We freethinkers with our ears open, we should listen to this. Wakefulness requires it. If it's done without bitterness, right? For the indignant and whoever perpetually tears and lacerates with his own teeth himself or as a substitute the world or God or society may indeed, morally speaking, stand higher than the laughing and self-satisfied satyr. But in every other sense, they're more ordinary, more indifferent, and less instructive case. And no one lies as much as the indignant do. Exactly. So that's where the careful listening comes in. And I think that we're all on YouTube doing this. I don't think there's any of us that aren't watching some of the Amazing Atheist or whomever it is that you might find fodder or something, or pulp entertainment, or even non-entertaining, but we listen to these people, and this is really where the YouTube atheism community is coming from. Not through an aptness, but just like, well, we need to hear the noise of this criticism. And then, when it gets to the thunderfoot of like, no, I'm not criticizing mankind or our urges or anything, I'm going to glorify those, then a more intellectual type will get suspicious at that moment. Right. What's that about? Is that really different? What is the critique exactly at that point? Okay, aphorism 27. It is hard to be understood, especially when one thinks and lives gangastrodagati, which means something about the gut, which means, oh wait, he says, among men who think and live differently, namely kurmagati, or at best the way frogs walk, mandagati. I'm tearing up in a bad way, the pronunciations of those. I obviously do everything to be quote unquote hard to understand myself. So he's passing comments, but that are passing many times. Hard to understand. People think he contradicts himself, but really it's just hard to understand. You need to go to the level where the only thing that's left is the part that isn't contradictory. That part's not hard to understand. And off of those non-contradictions are a great deal of possibilities, which can and should contradict. And one should be cordially grateful for the goodwill to some subtlety of interpretation. As regards the good friends, however, who are always too lazy and think that as friends they have a right to relax, one does well to grant them from the outset some leeway and romping place for misunderstanding. Then one can even laugh, or get rid of them altogether, these good friends, and also laugh. It's hard to be understood. Um, so it means with the gate of a river, the gate of the river Ganges. So it means the way the Ganges flows, um, what, swift and deep, right? And then the Kurmagati means as a tortoise moves, and then the Manduka Gati. These are Sanskrit terms um, or constructions. Uh, which he's saying is the frog sees, but hmm. Anyway, so that's a hard to get aphorism. I'll tell you, but I know what he's getting at. He's getting at uh, the detachment from dogma. We're going to get into that. 28. It's when he's making assumptions that you are gathering, right? He does not argue for the things like if the French Revolution was done horrifically, he's not going to be arguing for a thing like that. He's going to be saying, you know, this is what it was and here's the role it plays. He's not going to be arguing, oh, you should take it this way. You think it was great to have a reign of terror in that situation, and I don't, blah, 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 blah. He doesn't take it that way. You can have a conversation where you put assumptions in place that that's only the people that understand, not necessarily agree with and have those assumptions themselves, but they have to at least understand the assumption. To understand what he's saying, you might have to understand an assumption like this. Okay, and 27 is sort of, I would say it's a foreshadowing kind of aphorism. What is most difficult to render from, whereas 16 on the I think therefore I am, is analytic. Okay, what is most difficult to render from one language into another is the tempo of its style, which has its basis in the character of the race, or to speak more physiologically, in the average tempo of its metabolism. There are honestly meant translation that as involuntary vulgarizations are almost falsifications of the original, merely because its bold and merry tempo, which leaps over and obviates all dangers and things in words, and could not be translated. A German is almost incapable of presto in his language, thus also, as may be reasonably inferred, of many of the most delightful and daring nuances of free-spirited thought. Okay, so here he's definitely being old school, previous age, not a way we would talk about races of this, or even if we tried to find away cultures. But he's doing it very differently insofar as usually that's done to say why one's own culture was great, was better. He immediately uses it to criticize his own culture. And the language in which he wrote his books, which he tried to write with presto, in a language he says you can't write in presto with. So how do you unravel that? It's like I unravel it as Nietzschean pride. The language isn't even good for what I'm writing, which is why it's all the more genius to write this way in it. That's really how that comes out. And then inside there, you have a lot of ideas about how philosophy is stored in the language, whether it's your race or culture or just your personal cadence, your personal tempo. Coming into this as an individualist, I often read things that way. On an individual level, I find this easy to accept. As making characterizations for a race or a culture, uh, less and less so, right? You can say, well, here's the subculture and here's how it's defined and it has a characteristic tempo. But to me, it's only going to be really true when you get down to the individual. Their tempo, their language has this is they're dependent on their tempo and language for the kinds of thoughts they can have. And just as the buffoon and satire, excuse me, the buffoon and satyr are foreign to him in body and conscience, so Aristophanes and Petronius are untranslatable for him. Everything ponderous, viscous, and solemnly clumsy, all long-winded and boring types of style, are developed in profuse variety among Germans. Forgive me the fact that even Goethe's prose, in its mixture of stiffness and elegance, is no exception, being a reflection of the quote-unquote good old time to which it belongs, and a reflection of German taste at a time when there still was a German taste, a Rococo taste in moribus et artibus, in morals and art. Lessing is an exception, owing to his histrionic nature, which understood much and understood how to do many things. He was not the translator of Bayle for nothing, and liked to flee to the neighborhood of Diderot and Voltaire, and better yet that of the Roman comedy writers. In tempo, too, Lessing loved free thinking and escaped from Germany. But how could the German language, even in the prose of a Lessing, imitate the tempo of Machiavelli, who in his Principe lets us breathe the dry, refined air of Florence, and cannot help presenting the most serious matters in a boisterous allegrissimo, perhaps not without a malicious, artistic sense of the contrast he risks, long, difficult, hard, dangerous thoughts, and the tempo of the gallop, and the very best, but most capricious humor. Okay, I think it's interesting, his comments on Machiavelli, the humor, the danger of the ideas. Again, what I want to point out is the way he's characterizing, the tempo of a race. It's like, well, the people that overcome that limitations, like a Lessing to a lesser degree, Goethe, who he praises greatly in general, and in other passages less reservedly, and he apologizes almost for his assessment here of Goethe. He's saying that exception, right? Not more interesting than rule necessarily officially, but it's still an exception. And Lessing then is able to do what the tempo of the language is not designed in general to do, right? So these characterizations, at the very least, they're not cages. They're patterns you could fit within, you could fit without, Okay. Who finally could venture on a German translation of Petronius, who, more than any great musician so far, was a master of presto and invention, ideas, and words? What do the swamps... He says, I did the emphasis wrong. He's saying who could translate, Petronius into German. Kempeden. What do the swamps of the sick, wicked world, even the ancient world, matter in the end? When one has the feet of a wind as he did, the rush, the breath, the liberating scorn of a wind that makes everything healthy by making everything run. And as for Aristophanes, I remember. That transfiguring complementary spirit for whose sake one forgives everything Hellenic for having existed, provided one has understood in its full profundity all that needs to be forgiven and transfigured here. There is nothing that has caused me to meditate more on Plato's secrecy and Sphinx nature than the happily preserved petite fate that under the pillow of his deathbed there was found no Bible, nor anything Egyptian, Pythagorean, or Platonic, but a volume of Aristophanes. How could even Plato have endured life, a Greek life he repudiated, without an Aristophanes? I'll just go back, just change the pronunciation every time. Oh man, good question. No, I'm not that familiar. So I mean, with all of these literary references and many that I, have learned over the years afterwards. I'm somewhat familiar with secondary ideas, and certainly Nietzsche's ideas of Goethe. I haven't read his stuff myself. I don't remember at all reading even excerpts. I mean, very short excerpts. I mean, Nietzsche probably quotes him, but Lessing, I recognize that name, know nothing about him. Machiavelli, of course, I know, and I read recently, so I have fresh in mind what he's going here. I find that interesting, the capricious humor, because if you read that book assuming there's subtle jokes in there and basing the possibility on Machiavelli's other writings, which I haven't, I want to read the Discourses on Livy. I've read people quoting from it that seem to make this point. It's quite possible that there's some subtle humor and satire in The Prince, and yet you wouldn't say it's insincere as a message advocating what we would call ruthless Machiavellian attitudes as appropriate for princes. Okay, so that was 26, 27, and 28.